The fleet drifted like a jeweled necklace across the night, an arc of star-bright hulls and hard geometry threaded through emptiness. Thousands of ships, each the size of a city, each sheathed in stacked armor and hung with weaponry like metals, rode the slow tide of interstellar drift. Their drives whispered, their lights glittered, their escorts fanned out in layers so precise they could have been etched on glass. The Empire called it a demonstration, as though the galaxy were a stage and power, a kind of theater. On the command dais of the Sovereign of Adones, Grand Admiral Cale Varos stood immobile as sculpture, studying the arrayed formation. The transparent screens around him showed beams of data braided into tactical lace, supply flows, picket rotations, refueling windows, ordnance checks, measured, indexed, optimal. His reflection sat ghosted over the sea of figures, a sharp jaw, gray at the temples, a uniform that fit like a sentence without a wasted word. If there was fear in him, no instrument could find it. "Range to the periphery limit," he asked, without looking away. 3 hours, 42 minutes, sir," replied Captain Marin Reese, his flag captain from the tier below. "Pickets have extended to the 6th shell. Net integrity at 99.9. 99.9 is not 100, Varos said. Reese smiled, a practice run of charm. "It rounds, Sir War, doesn't." Around them, the bridge hummed in the disciplined way of places where consequences are intimate. Engineers pulsed through checklists. Navigators leaned into equations. Marines drifted at the periphery like carved obsidian. At the far end of the pit, the sensor cadre worked with hands that rarely stopped. Waves of quiet chatter moved like breezes over tall grass, rising when someone discovered a new inefficiency to strangle, falling when the numbers clicked into place. Lieutenant Lyra Tams, youngest of the sensor leads, and very aware of it, rubbed a knuckle under her eye and told herself to breathe. She'd been awake for 30 hours because an admiral's demonstration tolerated no surprises, and the periphery tolerated nothing else. The world out here a million light-years of no one's map had ways of pulling threads out of the Empire's tapestry. You secured those threads, or you were court-martialed for letting them fray. Her screens showed the clean roll of background radiation, the polite cough of cosmic rays, the faint linting of dust and ice where nothing should be. She tuned out the expected until the unexpected had somewhere to land. Lieutenant said her supervisor, a man who wore exhaustion like a medal. "Take another pass on the scatterbands. We had a blip." "What kind of blip?" "The kind that shouldn't exist. The kind worth a career up or down." Tams keyed in a verification sweep. It wasn't that the sensors saw something, it was that they saw less. A patch of nothing, as if the void had gone smoother, where void was already smooth. She scratched the back of her wrist, feeling, as she sometimes did, like a violinist tuning a string no one else could hear. A comms officer said brightly to fill the silence. "Fleet Broadcasting requests permission to push ceremony feeds. There's a demand spike from the core worlds. They want the Admiral's remarks." Varos's mouth turned up as if he tasted something sweet. "Granted," he said. "Let them see what they paid for." What they paid for was awe. On the outer shells, destroyers, in figure-8 patterns laced routes for the drones that carried the Empire's eye farther still. Above and below, carriers opened like mouths to let out minnowcraft and catch them again. The fleet spined the half-dozen supercarriers, and their capital escorts glowed gentle as moons. Each was named for a triumph. Each carried a history so heavy that officers bowed as they approached the ship's murals. And yet, alongside the hum, a second current, whispers. They traveled along mess tables at shift change through the hissing lanes of the lower decks. In the quiet minutes after lights out, when the mind made stories with whatever it had to hand, they called it the unknown, because any other word would have made it ordinary, and because sailors in any age loved the comfort of a capital letter. The unknown didn't mean an enemy. An enemy had a face, and, eventually, a treaty. The unknown didn't. It was what remained when maps ran out. What sensors returned as a shrug. What veterans lowered their voices to describe and then didn't finish. The older ones talked about an outpost gone dark on station day, about a convoy that arrived, missing the middle ship with the 2 end ships still anchored to empty space with toll lanes. Some told jokes, some made charms, trading them like contraband. A twist of wire, a sliver of hull plating polished to a mirror, a scrap of fabric from a world most of them would never see. Superstition, Captain Reese said, when a junior officer admitted he'd slept with a coin under his tongue. If fear could be chewed and swallowed, we'd be invincible. The juniors laughed, grateful for the line to hold on to. Veros had no time for myths. He had charts. He had a fleet that could burn a continent into a cautionary tale. He had the weight of 1,000 worlds calibrated into the tilt of his head. He had, too, the knowledge that power performed was power retained. The periphery was not only space, it was theater, and the audience had paid for dominion. "Lieutenant Tams," he said suddenly, voice carrying like a throne blade. "Report the..." Pit stilled. She straightened so fast, her back popped. "Sir." "Minor distortions in the scatter bands at 0 to 8 by 9, transient negative deviation of background at threshold minus -0.02. Repeating in a Fibonacci interval." "Approximately," he repeated. Not unkindly, she swallowed. "Unclear if pattern or coincidence. I'm widening. The intake cone and splicing to thermal to cross-check. Request permission to run a blind noise injection on the shell net to test for interference." Reese lifted an eyebrow. Blind noise injections made escort captains complain. Veros nodded anyway. "Granted. Flag to outer shells. Temporary static expected. Keep your shirts on." Laughter bled out some tension. Tams ran the injection, watched how the fleet's sensor lattice digested the static, how the outer pickets' returns softened and then sharpened. In the whitened sea of numbers, the negative returned again there, not there, there. "Sir," she said, softer. "It's persistent. Magnitude, still. Small but consistent." Reese leaned on the rail, a fog bank in a vacuum. Veros looked like a man aligning chess pieces. "Projector interference." "Negative," Sir Tams said. "I've tested against all internal emitters. No bleed, no harmonic with fleet drives. External source." She hesitated because there was the proper answer, and then there was what her instinct said, unknown. He smiled at that, and she didn't know why until he said, "The only honest answer in a truthful war." He turned to comms. "Cut fleet broadcasting to the lower grids. Keep the spectacle, strip the telemetry. If something is watching, let it watch us dance." Asterisk, sir. May I suggest Reese began?" Veros lifted a hand. "No, we don't, shudder. When a breeze touches the silk, we make the silk sing." It was bravado, but also doctrine. Empire ships did not flinch. Flinching was for provincials and poets. The bridge lights dimmed fractionally as the big screens optimized for the periphery's emptiness, the black swallowing all but the essential. In that black, the fleet looked almost fragile, a fortunate illusion that made men underestimate the iron. Tams widened the cone again and reached for an old trick. Subtract a model of the universe from the universe and see what refused to be erased. Predict the background, fold it into symmetry. Ask the remainder to please stand up. Lines of equations ran and ran longer and resolved into a residue shaped like a question. "Supervisor," she whispered. He leaned in, grimaced. "I hate it because it's wrong, because it's neat." He tapped the location marker. If it were instrument drift or junk data, it would spatter. "This is a cut," a voice from the lower decks, distorted by channel bounce, bled into the pit. "Sysja stories. The Corps sends us out here to scare the children and the colonies." Another voice, "Then why do the doors lock faster at night?" The Empire had no night in space, but they dimmed and brightened the lights according to a central clock, because human minds did better with rhythm. As shift change approached, the fleet's corridors cooled and grew quieter. The cooks set the heaters lower. The maintenance crews parked their carts. The chaplains, because even empires kept them lit, small electric candles in the few sanctioned nooks where a man could be alone with a thought that did not serve the state. On the Sovereign's mess deck, Petty Officer Den Sorrel watched a static ripple on the mural screen and thought about his brother, who had hated the sea on their dust world so much he'd joined the Navy to get away from it. The unknown, Den said to no one in particular, is just the name we give to not being the biggest thing. A mechanic across from him snorted. And then the warning chime sent them both to their feet. On the far edge of the sixth shell, destroyer-bladed Mercy altered course by a fraction. To ride a drift current in the destroyer's nose, a forward tech begged the sensors to eavesdrop on the future. The captain, who had more scars than years left, drew a circle on her armrest with a thumbnail, and told herself that boredom was victory's truest face, negative fluctuation. Her sensor mate murmured, "At starboard bow range, 10,000. No thermal, no mass. Negative what? Just less. Less of what?" The bladed Mercy's captain almost laughed a kind of laugh people used when the sermon went long and the air felt thin. Mark at send to net. On the Sovereign, the mark prickled across Tams's screen like a finger drawn on skin. She felt the wrongness in her teeth. The data didn't spike or howl. It smoothed. It made a calm place where there should have been honest noise. In the calm, numbers slid to icily. It made calculation slick, Sir Tams said, voice thin. "Advise we contract the outer shells by 2% and reorient the pickets to cross-illuminate the gap. If it's a natural phenomenon, we'll characterize. If it's not, Reese said, we'll look like we're retreating." 2% is a breath, Tams said. "Not a retreat, a brace," Veros considered. The admirals gathered around him, avatars from other flagships, faces limned by distance tilted slightly inward as if drawn. They all had different flavors of pride, but pride just the same. Veros lifted a finger. "Make the brace." Orders slid like rain through the fleet. Engines exhaled. Vectors kinked inward by the softest geometry. From above, it would have looked like a dancer inhaling before the grand gesture. Nothing happened. Then the lights on Tams's console dimmed for a heartbeat. She checked power, found it green. The smoothing grew smoother. Her model of the universe sighed, as if relieved to be closer to the world. "Sir," she whispered, "the residue is the residue sharpened." On bladed Mercy, the forward tech said what in a very small voice, because a line had appeared on his screen where lines should not be. Not a line exactly, more like the memory of one. "Mark," he said, marking, "uploading to net." The upload arrowed toward the fleet's spine end, hit the smoothing like a pond it reached. It sank. It did not return. Captain said softly, as if not to startle a wild animal. He repeated, and nothing moved. The data packet that should have danced through the fleet's lattice had found an easier path into absence. Back on the Sovereign, Tams's supervisor said, "We've lost the Mercy's packet." And the words sounded like "we've lost the Mercy," because all losses rhymed in the mind. "Patch direct," Veros said. "We come swallowed." "We can't. The channel's clean, sir, but it's like talking through a pillow." "The more we push, the more less," Tam said, because there was no better language. "Sir, the negative deviation's growing." "How fast?" "Not fast at all," she said. "Afraid now, because fast would at least have been familiar. Like water rising in a room you forgot had a door." Reese straightened. "Recommend we light the grid." "Full spectrum ping, maximum luminosity, force the field to reveal itself." "Do it," Veros said. The fleet sang. Every ship, from courier to capital, put its voice into the net. The ping went out a cathedral bell through vacuum, a question asked in every language the Empire knew how to speak. It hit the smoothing, and spread thin. Numbers came back with their bones rearranged. The bridge looked for a breath like a chapel where someone had just spoken the forbidden name. Then everything was as it had been. Screens glowed. Men breathed. Orders flicked like cards, only the residue remained neat as a razor cut. "Status, unbladed Mercy," Veros asked, responding, "Come set at once," because the destroyer was still answering. Short pings, spaced like heartbeats. "Captain reports instrument anomalies only. No physical contact, no thermal signature, no hull stress," she requests. "Permission to fire a marker buoy into the anomaly." Veros's mouth tilted again. Permission granted. Across the fleet, crews leaned toward their screens without meaning to. The buoy ejected, unfurled its little mind, and flashed a hello as bright as a child's laugh. The residue took it. The buoy's hello went silent mid-syllable. Not cut, but gently erased, as if a careful hand had lifted it from the page. On the Sovereign, nobody laughed. The whispers in the decks below would make up for that later. For now, the fleet hung in a night that suddenly felt thicker than distance. Veros clasped his hands behind his back. "To Reese," he said, barely audible, "adjust the script. Cut the flourish in my speech, sir. If this is theater, we've found the wrong audience." Tams, who was not supposed to hear, heard. She looked at the residue that kept being neat and thought not, for the first time, that neatness was not the friend. She had been taught it was. The unknown had not struck. It had arrived and set a place, maintained formation. Varro said, "Watch, measure, do not blink." Asterisk, asterisk, the dead moon didn't look like much, just a pitted stone suspended over a gas giant the color of old bruises. Its night side wore a shawl of metallic dust. Its day side wore nothing at all. The Empire had catalogued it centuries ago and filed it with other astronomical furniture. No life, no reason. Humans loved places like that. In the shadow of the moon's ragged terminator, a structure hugged the crater walls like frost. To an imperial scope, it would have been a smear of natural albedo. To a more careful eye that knew what not to look for, it was a station built to be the opposite of a broadcast. Absorption upon absorption. A geometry of silence. They called it Orpheus. Inside, a dozen people moved in a choreography, optimized for not bumping shoulders. Air scrubbers whispered. Paper-thin displays slid information along rails of soft light. There were no insignia on the walls. No flags, only a strip of hand-painted stars above the main console where some long-ago tech had marked the constellations of home and written, small and stubborn, "Remember the sky that remembers you. Commander." Aya Mercer read the periphery like prayer. She had the weathered calm of someone who had outlived several predictions of her death, and a scar along her collarbone that turned white when the air ran cold. She stood with a cup of bitter tea cooling between her palms. Watching the data curl inward confirm the smoothing, she said, Jules Okoye, senior analyst and patron saint of sleeplessness, didn't look up from his lattice of equations. Confirmed. It's not drift. It's not a thermal burp. And before you ask, it's not us. Orpheus is dark. Our beacons are dimmer than the background. Our drive residue is under solar noise. And I could lace this station through a minefield of imperial sensors without brushing a single whisker. Merce sipped and grimaced. You have on a rainy day for morale. He twitched a slider there. Listen, the room didn't change, and yet it did. A layer of soundless pressure folded over the ambient. The hala at the room's center, a loose globe of gridded void, displayed the Empire's fleet as a faint skein. Their formal formation beautiful, arrogant, hung like jewelry at the edge of a widening lake of less. Water rising in a room. You forgot how to door, Okoye murmured. Mercer flicked him a look. Poetry, Jules pilfered, he said. A young lieutenant on their flagship thought at first. She has good instincts, someone said from the back, Captain Rhea. Solace had just drifted in, shedding her helmet like a second face. She had the kind of smile that assumed complicity in the quiet steps of a woman whose ships did not leave footprints. Behind her, two members of her crew, one broad-shouldered, one wiry, peeled off toward the ready alcoves, their whispers folding under the hum. Did you patch their flag bridge again? Mercer asked, without heat. Passive intake only, Sola said. We like our invisibility where it is. She brushed frost from her sleeves. The Grand Admiral doesn't blink often. He nearly did just now. Okoye rotated the hala. The residue line sharpened like a healed scar. It had a neatness that made even the nanonalists in the room uneasy. One of the navigation techs, a kid with a braid wrapped twice around his wrist for luck, fidgeted with the glove seals at his neckline. We've seen this pattern at 13 periphery incidents in the last decade, Okoye said. Smaller, shallow. Enough to make an outpost's timekeeping fussy or a convoy's come stumble. We flagged it, we modeled it, we whispered to anyone who would listen. And the Empire, Sola said, listened by doubling their parade budget. Arrogance is a kind of insulation, Mercer said, not unkindly. You don't feel the cold until it breaks. She set the cup aside. On the far wall, a strip of pale paint marked a timeline of human ships and stations, lost in the effort. To be small, there were not many names. That was the point. Humans had learned early that the periphery didn't reward size. It rewarded humility, curiosity, and a bag of tricks you never showed twice. Status of our assets. She asked Solus, let the question roll through her head, counting the way she counted the base beats of her ship's drive. Stealth cruisers Wisp and Peregrine on cold drift inside the Empire's 6th shell and beyond it. gleam and crackle. Sitting on the dark side of the gas giant's rings, power expenditures indistinguishable from ring friction. 3 listening buoys pegged to the shadow of debris that isn't there. Anansi net ready, 8 nodes, anchored and sleeping. Our fuel and food give us 60 days if we don't light the sky, 30 if we do. And if we do, Mercer said, we make it count. She pinched the residue curve wider. We predicted this would come. We didn't predict the scale. Okoye shrugged one shoulder. Prediction is a polite word for luck. Wrapped in math, we got lucky. Early. Mercer looked around the room, made herself meet every gaze. Recite it, she said. Crisp. It was ritual, but not for tradition's sake. It was a way of sealing your mind against panic, a sequence hammered into the backbone, so that when the heart began to run, it had steps to run on. The unknown is not a fleet. It is not a will. It is a condition. It smooths where noise should be. It prefers neatness to chaos. It erases signal, not matter until signal and matter become the same. It cannot be fought with mass, or with slogans, or with spectacle. It can be mapped with patience. It can be slowed with asymmetry. It can be fooled by stories. Good, Mercer said. We'll give it a story then. Solace's smile tilted. I have a few. On the Hala, the Empire's destroyer fired a marker buoy into the neatness sand. The neatness ate the greeting like a courteous host, removing crumbs from a tablecloth. No flair, no drama, just absence. A murmur rippled through Orpheus's crew. None of them were surprised. That was worse than surprise. Empire's going to escalate, Okoye said. They'll light their grid and shout at the dark. The dark will applaud and keep eating. They won't retreat, Solace said. They can't, Mercer said. Not with 1,000 eyes on them and a doctrine that spells sovereignty. As spectacle, they watched a moment longer. On the bridge of the Sovereign, patched through a chain of passive reflections and refractions so convoluted it might as well have been witchcraft, the Grand Admiral clasped his hands and adjusted. A speech he would no longer give. A young lieutenant, the one with the metaphors, kept her spine straight and her breath small. On the outer shell, bladed mercy pulsed a brave little rhythm into a tide that translated courage into silence. Activate Anansi nodes, 1 through 3, Mercer said. Keep 5 through 8 cold. I want our web strung where the Empire won't think to look, but where the unknown's neatness will have to cross. Acknowledged, said the wiry crewman, sliding into a harness. His name was Taeon. He had come from a city of vertical farms where the wind was trained to blow in polite circles. Out here, he had learned to love untidy breezes. Rhea Mercer went on, Your wisp is our canary. I want her as close to the smooth as you dare without putting us on the Empire's altars. No overt emissions. Let the gravity Listen, if the neatness rubs the fabric, they'll sing. They always sing a little off-key, Solace said, pleased. The unknown likes its table set. We'll scrape a fork across the plate. And Peregrine, shadow the Empire's come spine, Solace said. Not to cut yet, to read their thresholds. I want to know the breath before the shout. Mercer nodded approval. Okoye, give me a differential model. Empire pings versus unknown smoothing. Over the last 3 minutes, look for harmonic avoidance. If the unknown is neat, it will prefer certain quiets. We will choose noise. Okoye's fingers flew, lines braided and unbraided. There, he said. Preferred voids at bands 19 and 23. It hates ragged. He smiled without mirth. So we'll be ragged. Humans are good at that, Tian said dryly. The station's lighting shifted a fraction toward amber, the artificial dusk that signaled shift change and fooled no one. Someone set a pot of something spiced on the induction ring, and the smell wound through the air like a promise. Orpheus ran on sparse comforts, hot food, warm socks, a handful of jokes, traded until the edges dulled. Do we warn them? Asked. The navigation tech, with the braided wrist, everyone knew who them was. The Empire had never noticed humanity's listening posts. On the few occasions it had misidentified them as aesthetic anomalies and moved on. Pride made poor eyes. Mercer's jaw moved once before she answered. We warn anyone who can hear without betraying where the voice comes from. No lectures. No I-told-you-SOS. Pure signal. Okoye built the message with an ascetic's care, a narrow band pulse masked as thermal noise. layered with phase jitter that would itch the unknown's neatness and slide past. He wrote the words in unadorned standard: "To any captain receiving this, your instruments are correct. Do not increase emission power. You are feeding the absence. Contract formation. Cross-illuminate with misaligned pings. Avoid regular intervals. Deploy passive markers on chaotic trajectories. Do not send beacons directly into the anomaly. If you must retreat, do so without announcing noise is safety. Rhythm is hazard." He sent it and looked, for a beat, like a man who had thrown a rope to a stranger in a flood, and remembered the river had no interest in ropes. On the Hala, a scatter of Imperial escorts adjusted their vectors, so slight it could have been coincidence. The message had landed somewhere, or not. With the unknown, correlation had learned to be modest. Commander Solis said quietly, "We built these stations to watch and whisper, not to fight." "We won't fight," Mercer said. "We'll cheat." She brought up a schematic of the Anon Z-net. It was a joke in the training manual's nursery story strapped to physics, but it had teeth. 8 nodes, each a lump of manufactured mess, could be triggered to exhale stochastic microbursts across dozens of bands. Individually, they were noise. Together, deployed on precise, ugly vectors, they sketched an absence of absenza, just a toe, just enough to see if it looks down. Tian's hands danced. Somewhere invisible, Node 1 woke, as if from a bad dream, and coughed into the dark. Node 2 replied with a different cough, out of time. Node 3 sneezed on purpose. In the Hala, the neatness wrinkled the smallest frown. Okoi's breath left him. "It noticed, but not us," Sola said. "It noticed the pattern of not pattern." She shook her head. "Gods, I hate clever enemies that aren't enemies." "We're not here to win a war of metaphors," Mercer said. "We're here to make sure there's a later." She tapped the strip of hand-painted stars. "Remember the sky that remembers you," she added, not as sentiment but as instruction. "We do not become neat." An amber light winked at the edge of the board. Wisp had slipped to within a whisper of the smoothing and sent back the data like contraband. Her gravimetric mesh was singing in those off-key notes Solus loved tiny asymmetries in the weave. Like a tablecloth tugged at 3 non-adjacent corners by invisible hands, Okoi layered Wisp song over the Empire's latest ping. The interference pattern bloomed into a petaled thing and then folded inward. "If they push harder," he said, "it will give them less faster. Then they'll push harder," Sola said. "They're built that way. We're built differently," Mercer said. "Good, let's live that difference." She keyed a tight beam to Peregrine. "If the Empire tries a focused lance, we shadow their flank and introduce jitter. You'll look like their echo. If they collapse shells, we open a corridor with Ananzi 5 through 8 and herd the destroyers through before their pride kills them. No direct contact unless a ship is bleeding. We do not become their story. We remain a rumor. And if the unknown turns its head," Solus asked. "Then we'll bow," Mercer said, "and tell it a better story." On the Hola, the Empire began to sing again, louder instruments straining to be heard by a thing that loved silence. The neatness responded with that implacable politeness. Smoothing, smoothing, smoothing. Bladed Mercy's heartbeats faltered and steadied. A young lieutenant on the Sovereign set her jaw and widened a cone and subtracted a universe from a universe and measured what refused to be gone. "Mark the time," Mercer said. "This is the last hour before the first ship vanishes." No one asked how she knew. They had all read the ledger of smaller incidents. They had all seen how the curve steepened after the moment when neatness learned the shape of its meal. In the quiet that followed, the station's systems ticked like a cooling engine. Mercer lifted her cup, found the tea cold, and drank it anyway. "We'll be ready," she said. It wasn't bravado. It was the kind of sentence that made a thin bridge between now and the next. Now, and asked you to step Okoi, flicked a final layer onto the Halle human assets, overlaid on Imperial theater. Threads of planned ugliness intersecting with the Empire's. Straight lines. He stood back, and, because he permitted himself one superstition, touched the painted star marked for home. "Someone once told me," Sola said, almost cheerfully, "that humans are very good at making a mess in precisely the right place." Mercer watched the neatness frown and smooth, frown and smooth. "Then let's make a masterpiece." Outside, beyond rock and paint and breath, the unknown set another place at its invisible table. Orpheus tightened the knots of its web. The fleet glittered, beautiful as ever, and somewhere in the careful dark, a human ship exhaled a single, ragged laugh and vanished from every instrument in the galaxy except the ones built by the people who had expected that to happen. The void stretched endless and indifferent, but within the Empire's fleet, silence was beginning to feel heavy, unnatural, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath. Thousands of ships floated in perfect formation, lights and engines, arranged with mechanical precision, the product of centuries of doctrine. To the admirals, it was beauty and power incarnate. To the sailors on the lower decks, it was a shield of steel and arrogance. And yet, to those who dared whisper when the officers were gone, there was another word unknown. On the far edge of the sixth shell, the destroyer-bladed Mercy moved through her assigned patrol lane. The crew tried to mask their unease with laughter and charms, the small tokens that sailors traded when fear crawled too close to the skin. The captain repeated her mantra with the calmness of experience. Boredom was safety, routine was survival. Then, without flash or fire, without even a cry across the coms, the Mercy simply ceased to exist. One heartbeat, she was visible on every tactical display, her drives burning steady. The next heartbeat, she was gone, her space smoothed as though she had never been. The fleet grid tried again and again to find her, to draw her outline in data, but every signal dissolved into perfect nothing. The Sovereign's bridge erupted. Voices tangled over one another, telemetry lost, quadrant blind, no debris, no mass. Shadow. The pit swarmed with frantic motion until Grand Admiral Veros raised his hand, and the noise died like a candle in vacuum. His voice carried through the silence, sharp and deliberate. A destroyer did not vanish, he said. It was mechanical failure, reactor breach, systems collapse. That was the report to be filed, the truth to be spoken. To admit otherwise would be to give power to fear. Yet among the officers, one pair of eyes did not agree. Lieutenant Lyra Tams stared at her console, at the neatness spreading across her data in Fibonacci rhythm, just as she had tracked for hours. The Mercy had not failed. She had been taken, erased. She wanted to speak, to force the words out, but the bridge was no place for superstition, no place for truths the Admiral had already denied. She bit down on her protest and let silence answer for her. The fleet adjusted. Thousands of ships shifting ever so slightly, tightening their lines, engines humming in unison. But with every attempt at order came new distortions. Some captains reported reflections of their own ships, flickering shadows that taunted sensors with impossible echoes. A frigate opened fire blindly into the dark, convinced an enemy had passed across its bow. Its captain swore on oath that something had been there, but when the fire faded, the instruments told only of perfect calm. Clean, smooth, too smooth. Fear, unacknowledged, crept from deck to deck, a ghost heavier than any battle loss. Men and women whispered in mess halls, their voices thin as thread. They remembered the stories their elders had told, the myths the Admiralty laughed at, and one by one they stopped laughing. The unknown had come, and it did not roar or strike. It erased. Another ship vanished. The cruiser Radiant Spear was mid-report, her captain's voice clear over the comnet when the sentence broke off into silence. No wreckage, no fire, just the echo of a voice that had ended too soon. Across the fleet, thousands of men froze at their stations. The tremor in their breath carried farther than any transmission. On the Sovereign's command, Deus Veros's expression remained carved in stone. He spoke with the certainty of doctrine, his words cold as the void. Whoever the enemy was, they wanted the Empire to panic, to break its order, and so, the Admiral declared, they would not oblige, the fleet would not retreat. Instead, they would answer absence with spectacle. They would form the Grand Wall. Engines roared, drives flaring as thousands of ships shifted into the largest, most symmetrical defensive formation in Imperial history. A wall of light, vast and shining, a monument of arrogance in the face of silence. Admirals called it unbreakable. Sailors called it suicide. And far away, in the hidden station of Orpheus, Commander Mercer and her human crew watched the display. With grim faces, They knew what symmetry meant. They knew what rhythm invited. The fleet had not built its shield. It had built the unknown its feast. The void waited, calm and patient, while the Empire's shining wall held its breath. The next disappearance was only a matter of time. The moon's shadow held Orpheus Station, as if it were a secret the stars themselves conspired to keep. Nothing in the Empire's archives marked this barren rock as worth attention. No ores, no water, no tactical value, just dust, craters, and silence. Yet silence was what humanity had chosen. Silence was what kept them alive while others burned brightly enough to be noticed. Within the station's hollowed chambers, light from holoscreens painted pale faces with restless glow. Lines of data, scrolled like prayers written too fast to read, but every eye in the room understood the meaning. A ship had vanished, not destroyed, not broken, vanished. And another had followed. It was no surprise to those who lived in Orpheus. They had seen this before, though never on such a scale. They had always known this day would come. Commander Aya Mercer stood at the center console, her back straight, her shoulders locked. She looked older than her years, a woman carved by duty and long nights spent staring at voids that stared back. The scar at her collarbone was white in the station's cold light, and her hands clasped behind her back trembled only slightly. A tremor she did not allow anyone to notice confirmed the disappearance. She said, voice level as if reading weather reports. Jules Okoye, bent over his lattice of equations, didn't look up. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, and his eyes were bloodshot, but exhaustion never dulled the sharpness of his mind. His fingers worked over the controls with the precision of a surgeon. Confirmed, radiant spear has been erased. Same. Signature as bladed mercy. Smoothness in the void, Fibonacci interval holding steady. No debris, no mass echo, no thermal trace. Mercer's lips pressed into a line, and the Empire. They formed the Grand Wall, Okoye answered. He tilted the Howley so the others could see. The Empire's glittering fleet was drawn across the void in perfect order. Thousands of ships lined into rows of symmetry, capital ships blazing at the center like a crown. Doctrinal, predictable, beautiful, if you believe in beauty as a weapon. Captain Rhea Solis leaned against the bulkhead, helmet tucked beneath her arm. She smiled, a small, wolfish smile that had nothing of humor in it. It's not a wall. It's bait. They've set their formation like an offering platter. The unknown won't have to hunt, it'll feed itself. Tian, wiry and fidgeting as he worked on the Anansi node controls, glanced up. 3 nodes awake, whispering noise. 4 and 5 still cold. It doesn't like the scratches. The neatness twitches whenever we cough. His braid, wound around his wrist, was pulled tight from habit, a sailor's superstition clinging to a soldier's mind. On the Hala, the neatness shivered. For a second, the smooth curve wrinkled, then returned to its perfect calm. There, Solis said, tilting her head like a predator scenting prey. You see, proof it notices, proof it can hear, Okoye countered, his voice grim. And, if it can hear, it can learn. Mercer's gaze hardened. Let it hear, let it learn. We'll give it something worth choking on. For a long moment, the room was filled only with the hum of machinery, the faint hiss of life support systems, the quiet ticking of metal under strain. Every soul in the station felt the weight of what they were witnessing. The Empire, bloated and proud, was stumbling toward a predator it didn't understand, and only humans, small and hidden, had spent the years preparing for this inevitability on the sovereign Yuvdans. Lieutenant Lyra Tams widened her cone again, hands moving fast over her console. She was tracing patterns, subtracting the universe from itself, desperate to define what refused to vanish. Her breath was tight in her chest, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She didn't know it, but she was brushing dangerously close to human interference. The chaotic static from the Anansi nodes scratched at her instruments. Irregular, ugly, something that made no sense in the Empire's perfect world. She frowned at it, confused, certain there was something hidden there. She's close, Mercer murmured when the anomaly spiked on their secondary monitors. That young one on the Sovereign, she's clever. If we push too far, she'll see us. Let her see, Solis replied, her smile curving sharper. Better a rumor than a myth. Rumors save more lives than speeches. Mercer didn't answer. She watched the neatness instead, expanding outward like ripples on black glass. The Empire was feeding it faster now. Every synchronized ping, every symmetrical maneuver, every shining ship in the wall giving the unknown rhythm to consume. The hollow flared. Another blip faded. A frigate this time, gone mid-sentence, its transmission severed clean. Panic shivered across Imperial channels, restrained but audible. 1,000 officers speaking in voices too tight, too quick. Okoye marked the moment with a tap of his stylus. "That's 3, he said softly. "The curve steepens now. They'll fall faster." Mercer exhaled through her nose, slow and steady. "Then we move faster." She turned her head toward Solace. "Wisp needs to brush the smooth. Close. As you dare, I want to know if the unknown has a heartbeat. Every tremor, every ripple it breathes, I want it recorded." Solace's eyes glittered. "If it breathes, Commander, let's just hope it doesn't inhale." Tian's hands moved deftly, activating another Anansi node. Out in the void, the hidden machines spat chaotic bursts across the bands the unknown loved most. Static, jitter, discord, not a song, but noise. Ugly human noise. The neatness rippled again, as if irritated. The wrinkle lasted longer this time before smoothing back into nothing. On the Sovereign, Lieutenant Tams leaned closer to her screen. Her data made no sense. The anomaly pulsed where it shouldn't, jagged, inconsistent, something that looked too much like intent. She wanted to report it, but the Admiral's voice still rang in her ears. Mechanical failure, reactor breach, nothing more. She clenched her fists and stared into the void, whispering under her breath words that would never reach her commander. "It's here, back on Orpheus Okoye, overlaid Imperial pings with unknown smoothing, the model taking shape with cold inevitability. The more order they give it, the faster it eats. Their doctrine is a banquet." He rubbed his tired eyes, and they'll keep feeding it until nothing's left but silence. Mercer straightened. Her voice cut through the room, quiet but carrying. "Then we'll give it something indigestible." She tapped the board, highlighting the web of the Anansi net, the tangle of nodes drifting unseen in the dark. 8 pieces of chaos strung across the void like a hunter's trap. When the time comes, we'll trip it. We'll snare its neatness in mess and noise. Not to defeat it, not yet. Just enough to buy time, for us. For whoever survives, the crew exchanged glances. None spoke the truth aloud, but each knew it. The Empire would not survive this. Their pride was their executioner, and their formations were the gallows. Humanity would endure, but only if their trap worked, only if they could make the unknown stumble. Outside the station's walls, the stars gleamed cold and indifferent. The Empire's grand wall blazed bright, a monument of arrogance painted across the void. And just beyond its edge, the neatness waited with patience older than empires. Mercer looked once at the hand-painted strip of stars above the console, the words written there by some forgotten crewman years before. "Remember the sky that remembers. You." She nodded to herself and whispered, "Not for the crew, but for the silence itself." The fleet of the Empire burned bright against the void. A wall of light and symmetry stretched across nothingness. From a distance, it looked invincible, a pattern too precise to be broken, too vast to be challenged. Within the ranks of its shining ships, however, dread had begun to seep like cold water into the bones of every sailor. 2 ships had vanished, then 3. Each disappearance left no trace, no debris, no fire. Just silence so clean it hurt to look at. Commanders barked their orders louder to mask their unease. Officers spoke with too much speed to disguise their trembling. And still the unknown widened its reach. On the bridge of the Sovereign, Grand Admiral Cale Veros stood like a statue carved from iron, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed. He watched the neatness creeping into their data and refused to name it. The word unknown had no place in doctrine. He would not give voice to fear. But deep in the pit, Lieutenant Lyra Tams knew better. Her instruments told the story that the Admiral's pride denied. Patterns grew sharper, Fibonacci intervals multiplying. Each wave of neatness timed perfectly to the fleet's own emissions. She widened her cone again, running subtraction after subtraction. Desperate to prove what her instincts already whispered, they were being eaten alive, one rhythm at a time. Across the void, hidden in the shadow of a lifeless moon, Orpheus Station. Hummed with grim resolve, Commander Aya Mercer paced slowly, her steps measured, her eyes fixed on the data blooming across the hala. The Empire's grand wall blazed brighter, but she saw not power, only food. Every pulse of light was a morsel offered. Every symmetrical maneuver was an invitation. "They don't know what they're feeding," she murmured. "They think they're displaying strength," Okoye replied, voice raw from exhaustion. He rubbed at his temples, dragging his stylus across the air to draw a curve that fell too neatly into place. But discipline is poison out here. The unknown craves order. The more perfect the rhythm, the more ravenous its hunger. Rhea, Solus, leaned with casual grace against a bulkhead, her eyes bright with something that looked like mischief, but was nothing of the sort. Then the grand wall isn't a shield, it's a dinner bell. Tien cursed softly under his breath as he coaxed life from another of the unanswered nodes. The little machines coughed static into the dark, irregular, ugly, a chorus of deliberate mistakes. "We're scratching its tablecloth. It doesn't like it." "Look," he gestured, and on the hala, the neatness wrinkled again, just for a moment. A shiver ran through the void, a ripple where smoothness faltered. "It noticed," Solus said. Her smile curved sharper. Okoye shook his head. "Don't cheer too quickly. If it notices, it can learn. And if it learns, we've given ourselves away." Mercer studied the ripple, her eyes narrowing. "Then we'll give it something it can't digest. We'll make ourselves ugly, messy, human." The room fell quiet. They all knew what she meant. Humanity had never survived the periphery by matching the Empire's grandeur. They had lived by hiding, by listening, by telling lies so crooked the unknown tripped over them. Orpheus wasn't a fortress. It was a whisper with teeth. On the far flank of the Empire's wall, another frigate flickered out mid-transmission. Panic trembled along cum lines, the careful rhythm of fleet discipline shattering beneath the weight of silence. Orders came fast, too fast. Shells shifted, lines tightened, every adjustment a frantic attempt to restore order. But with each move, the neatness spread faster, fattened on their perfection. Lieutenant Tams pressed her hand against her console, as if she could hold the ship steady through touch alone. She whispered words she would never speak aloud to her admiral. Stop feeding it, break the rhythm, make it ugly. She didn't know that, somewhere unseen. Humanity was already doing exactly that. In Orpheus Okoye's model brightened, overlaying the fleet's emissions with the unknown's responses. The curve is steepening. They've got hours at most. Before a cascade, once it begins, the vanishings will come one after another. They'll lose whole shells in minutes. Mercer exhaled slowly. Her scar stood out pale against her skin. Then we can't wait. Reowisp needs to brush the edge, close as you dare. I want every ripple recorded. If the unknown breathes, I want its heartbeat in our files. Solus's grin was quick, feral. If it breathes, Commander, let's pray we don't get swallowed. She snapped her helmet back into place and vanished into the docking bay. Minutes later, her stealth ship slid from the shadows, engines whispering softer than starlight, HULL, coded in the math of invisibility. The wisp drifted toward the neatness like a thief approaching a god's temple. Mercer turned back to the others. Tien Prime, the last of the Anansi net, don't trigger yet, just keep them ready. When the cascade begins, we'll trip it, ugly and loud by what time we can. And the Empire? Tien asked. Mercer's eyes were hard. The Empire is already dead. Our job is to make sure someone survives to learn from their funeral. On the Sovereign, Varro stood with arms behind his back, unshaken even as another ship winked into nothing. Do not break formation, he ordered, voice a hammer against rising panic. This fleet is the Empire. We are its will. We will not scatter before shadows. But in the mess decks below, sailors clutched their charms tighter. They whispered, the truth in voices thin with fear. The unknown has come, and no wall of light could save them, far out at the edge of sight. Wisp skimmed the smooth, her instruments alive with trembling notes. Gravity twisted, subtle and strange, as though the fabric of space itself was being tugged by invisible hands. The data streamed back to Orpheus, a song of asymmetry that made Okoye's breath catch. It's alive, he whispered. Not a creature, not in the way we think, but it moves with intent. It chooses. Mercer's jaw tightened. Then we give it a choice it cannot want. She looked at the Hala again, at the Empire's glittering wall, perfect and doomed. Humanity had no empire, no monuments of light. All they had was noise, tricks, and the stubborn refusal to vanish. The unknown was feeding, the Empire was breaking, and in the shadows of a dead moon, humanity prepared to step into the fire. The Grand Wall glittered with the defiance of an empire that had forgotten how to lose. Thousands of ships stretched across the void in flawless lines, their drives humming in synchronicity, their guns armed and ready. From afar, the formation was a cathedral of power, a monument to order. But within that monument, fear gnawed at the edges. Every sailor knew that 3 ships had already been erased, and none of them had been taken by battle. They had simply been made to vanish. On the bridge of the Sovereign, Lieutenant Lyra Tams worked like a woman possessed. Her fingers danced across her console, widening cones, subtracting models, layering filters, anything to give shape to what resisted shape. The neatness grew, smoothing with every cycle, and she saw how the fleet itself was feeding it. Every synchronized ping, every flawless maneuver was fuel. She wanted to scream it, to tell her admiral that perfection was poison, but her throat closed. The Grand Admiral had given his truth, and it allowed no contradiction. Varro stood as rigid as a statue, hands clasped behind him, his expression carved from stone. To him, disorder was defeat, fear was rebellion, and retreat was unthinkable. He saw not the neatness consuming his fleet, but the eyes of 1,000 worlds watching, expecting their empire to stand unbroken. His fleet would not scatter. If ships vanished, he would call it accident. If fear grew, he would call it cowardice. He had no room in his heart for the unknown. But an Orpheus station, hidden in the shadows of a barren moon, humanity did not share his blindness. Commander Aya Mercer stared at the Hala, at the vast wall of light arrayed against the void, and saw only weakness. Order was food. Rhythm was meat, and the unknown was already feasting. The wisp is in place, Rhea Solis's voice crackled. Through from her stealth cruiser, a whisper riding encrypted static. We're brushing the smooth, it's like sliding a blade along glass. The readings are ugly gravity, pulling sideways in half-seen jolts. The ship doesn't like it, neither do I. Stay steady, Mercer replied, her tone calm as still. Water. Get as close as you dare. We need the tremors. If it shifts, I want to know what moves it. On her screens, data bloomed like fractured music. The Wisp's instruments recorded distortions, not random, but pulsing in strange order. Okoye leaned close, his bloodshot eyes wide. It's breathing, he whispered. Not like lungs, not like a beast, but breathing all the same. Expansion and contraction, attention and inattention. It notices the Empire. It tastes them. Then let's see how it handles something that doesn't fit on its tongue, Mercer murmured. Tian's fingers flew over his console, priming the rest of the Anansi net. The nodes drifted in silence, waiting, each a tiny factory of chaos. Already, 3 of them spat noise into the void bursts of static. Irregular pulses, signals so jagged and asymmetrical, the Empire would never have tolerated them. The neatness rippled when the noise struck, wrinkling like water disturbed by pebbles. On the Sovereign, Tam saw the distortions again, faint and inconsistent. And confusion tightened her brow. Something was scratching the edges of the anomaly, but she couldn't tell if it was inside the fleet or outside. Her commander barked at her to focus on the wall, but the numbers whispered a different truth. Something else was out there, watching, interfering. Another ship vanished. A destroyer this time, swallowed mid-formation. One instant, its guns flared as part of a broadside drill. The next, there was no light, no hull, nothing but neatness where it had been. The formation adjusted instantly, ships sliding into the gap, but the silence that followed was not discipline. It was fear so deep that words could not reach it. Sailors gripped their charms tighter. Officers barked until their voices broke. And still, the unknown widened in Orpheus Mercer's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Trigger the 5th node. Tian's hand dropped to the control, and out in the void, Node 5 awoke. It coughed noise into the neatness, a chaotic burst of staggered rhythms, like a drum line, stumbling drunkenly across time. The neatness twitched, faltered. For a heartbeat, the smoothing pulled back as if confused, then surged again with greater hunger, it noticed. Solace breathed from the wisp, her voice threaded with awe. It noticed us. Okoi ran the numbers, lines of data burning into place. It didn't just notice. It tried to erase the node, but it couldn't. The chaos resisted. It can't smooth what doesn't fit. It can't digest the mess. Mercer's jaw tightened. Then humanity has its weapon. Noise, disorder. Everything the Empire despises. Another gap flared in the fleet's wall. A cruiser winked out, gone in silence. Then, almost on top of it, a frigate. The cascade was beginning. On the Sovereign, the Admiral's voice thundered against the rising panic. "Hold the wall. Do not break. We are the Empire, and we do not bend to shadows." But his words were brittle. Every officer heard it. Every sailor knew the truth. Shadows were already devouring them. In Orpheus, Mercer raised her hand. "Wake them all, every node. Trip the net." Tian slammed the controls. One by one, the Anansi nodes roared awake, each vomiting chaos into the void. Not in unison, never. In pattern, but in wild, jagged bursts. Static noise, misaligned pings, signals colliding and collapsing in deliberate mess. The void shivered. The neatness writhed, its smooth surface breaking into fractures, unable to process the ugliness forced upon it. On the Wisp, alarms wailed as the cruiser rocked under invisible pressure. Solace clung to her chair, laughing despite herself. "It doesn't like us, Commander. It doesn't like us at all," Good Mercer whispered. "Let it choke." The unknown hesitated. For the first time, it did not eat. It recoiled, wrinkling around the jagged noise. And in that hesitation, a handful of Imperial ships survived their next breath. They didn't know why. They didn't know who had bought them those seconds. But they would live them, unaware that, in the shadows of a forgotten moon, humanity had declared itself with noise and defiance. The cascade had been slowed, but not stopped. The fleet was breaking, the unknown was hungry, and the galaxy had just learned that humanity would not vanish. Quietly, the void shivered with echoes of chaos. The Unenzinet howled its ugly defiance, scattering jagged signals across the neatness that had been growing unchecked. For the first time since the unknown had appeared, the smoothness faltered. The ripple was small, almost imperceptible, but to the watchers on Orpheus, it was a victory. They had made it hesitate on the sovereign Euvidons. The hesitation was felt, but not understood. Consoles flickered with readings that made no sense, sensor returns bending in ways that should not have been possible. Lieutenant Lyra Tams bent over her board, her eyes wide as she traced the distortions. It's resisting," she whispered to herself. "Something's fighting it." She wanted to say the words aloud, to tell the Admiral that they were not alone in this void. But her voice died in her throat when she looked up and saw his face. Grand Admiral Veros had the expression of a man staring down inevitability and refusing to blink. His jaw was set, his back straight, his eyes cold. "We will hold," he said, not to her, not to anyone, but to the universe itself. The Empire does not bend. But the Empire was bending, and everyone in the fleet felt it. Another destroyer vanished, erased mid-transmission. Its voice cut clean out of the comnet. 2 frigates followed within minutes, their positions collapsing into silence. On the outer shells, escorts screamed warnings before disappearing, their last words trapped forever in the static of the grid. The cascade had begun in earnest. Ships were vanishing faster now, whole pockets of formation dissolving as the neatness spread, consuming order as if it were air. The wall was breaking. In Orpheus Station, Aya Mercer stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tight enough that her knuckles blanched. Around her, her crew moved with the urgency of men and women who knew they were dancing on the edge of extinction. Okoi's voice was hoarse as he read off numbers, watching the cascade climb. 3% of the fleet gone in 6 minutes. If the curve holds, 20% in half an hour. 50 before the first hour ends. "They won't last," Tian muttered, his braid pulled so tight around his wrist it left angry marks. "No wall, no doctrine survives that curve. They'll hold until they break," Mercer said softly. "That's the Empire's way. Pride, until death. Rhea Solis's voice cut in from the wisp, her words threaded with static. The unknown doesn't like us, Commander. It's pressing harder. My hull feels like it's being pulled apart by whispers, but it's still hesitating when the nodes cough. We're slowing it. Mercer closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Then, hold it as long as you can. Every second you buy is blood spared. On the Sovereign, Tams's console lit with a burst of static, unlike anything she had ever seen. Ugly, jagged, utterly without pattern. She leaned forward, transfixed. Something was out there. Something fighting. Her heart hammered as she whispered words she dared not share. Who are you? The cum-grid fractured amid the chaos of vanishings. A new signal broke through, faint, ragged, but unmistakably human in its cadence. It was not the Empire's crisp commands, not the smooth rhythm of doctrine. It was noise wrapped in message. Tams strained to parse it as her console translated fragments. Do not feed it. Break rhythm, cross-illuminate. Noise is safety. Rhythm is hazard. She froze. Someone was warning them. Someone who understood. The Admiral snapped his head toward her. Report. Tams hesitated, fear tightening her throat. Interference, sir. Unidentified. It might be an external source. Jamming, she swallowed hard. No, sir. Guidance, Ferris's eyes narrowed. For the briefest instant, the mask of certainty cracked. Someone else was in his theater, speaking to his fleet. His jaw clenched, and he barked, ignore it. Hold the wall. The Empire does not take orders from phantoms, but the words had already spread. Captains whispered the message across. There comes, relays carried it. Sailors clung to it like drowning men to driftwood. Noise is safety. Rhythm is hazard. Even without orders, some ships began to break formation slightly, their emissions jagged, their patterns messy. Those ships survived longer, sailors noticed, and whispers grew. On Orpheus, Okwai let out a bitter laugh. They heard us. At least some did. They won't all listen, Mercer said, but maybe enough. She turned to Tian. Spin the nodes. Different bands. Don't let the unknown adapt. Tian's hands flew. The unhandsy net spat new patterns, chaotic bursts across fresh frequencies. The neatness twitched, faltered again. It pressed harder, but it could not smooth the mess as easily dot from the wisp, Solis reported, her voice tight. The Empire's flagship is trying to compensate. They're flooding emissions to mask the vanishings. It's feeding the thing faster. Mercer's lips pressed into a hard line. They'll destroy themselves before they admit weakness. On the Sovereign, the Admiral's voice rang out, louder now, desperate to drown the truth. We will not scatter. We will not break. We are the will of the Empire. But his words carried no conviction. He was speaking to ghosts. Tam stared at the message, still flickering on her console. Noise is safety. She thought of the scratches in her data, the irregular pulses she had been seeing, the interference her Admiral dismissed. Someone was out, there unseen, fighting in ways the Empire never could. She didn't know who, she didn't know why, but in that moment, she believed them more than she believed her commander. And so, as the wall crumbled and the cascade spread, the Empire's fleet heard a voice that was not their own. Not a roar of power, not the command of doctrine, but the ragged whisper of humanity. The unknown had met resistance. The Empire had met truth. And in the silence between vanishings, a new war began not of weapons, but of stories. The void stank of fear. It rolled through the fleet in waves, carried in the too loud voices of officers and the shaking hands of sailors. Gripping charms they had sworn they didn't believe in. The Grand Wall, once bright and unyielding, now looked fractured, like a mirror beginning to splinter. Each ship lost was another crack spreading through the glass, and the cracks were multiplying faster than anyone could stop. On the Sovereign, Lieutenant Lyra Tams stared at the strange signal still trembling across her console. There was no imperial code, no doctrine, no command she had ever studied. Just a raw, jagged whisper clawing through the static, carrying words that struck her harder than any order ever had. Rhythm is hazard. She replayed it again and again, feeling the weight of each syllable. Someone else was out here, someone who knew, someone who had seen what the Empire refused to name. She wanted to tell the Admiral, to shout it across the bridge. But when she looked up, she saw his face, cold, furious, immovable. He would not hear it. Grand Admiral Veros stood with his hands locked behind him, jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck stood out like cords. He watched his fleet bleed into silence and refused to bend. "We are the Empire," he said, his voice carrying across the pit, across every come in the flagship. "We do not flinch, we do not scatter, and we do not take orders from ghosts." But the ghosts were already saving lives. Out on the far flank, a small cluster of frigates had broken formation. Their emissions stuttered irregularly. Their coms spat ugly static bursts. Their lights flickered with no rhythm. They looked sloppy, disordered, even mutinous. And they survived, where the perfect lines of the wall were erased in neat sequence. These messy little ships lingered, ragged in the dark, refusing to be smoothed away. Sailors noticed, whisper by whisper, the message spread. Noise is safety. On Orpheus Station, Commander Aya Mercer leaned over the hala, watching the pattern play out exactly as they had predicted. "They're listening," she murmured. "Not all, not enough, but some." McCoy scrubbed a hand down his face, exhaustion making his voice rasp, "and those who listen survive longer. The rest? They'll vanish, clinging to symmetry." "Rhea," Solace's voice cut in from the wisp, sharp and triumphant. "The neatness hates the unansi net. It's twisting, recoiling every time we cough. But it's pressing harder. It knows we're here." "Then it's time," Mercer said. Her voice was calm, steady, but her scar stood out white against her skin. "They need to hear us, not a whisper, a voice." For a long moment, silence filled the chamber. Humanity had hidden for so long, watching, listening, never revealing themselves. To speak now was to step into the light, to surrender their only shield of obscurity. But to remain silent was to watch the Empire crumble, to let the unknown devour. Unchecked, to doom not only the arrogant, but everyone who lived under their shadow. "Do it," Mercer said. Ukoi's fingers trembled as he keyed the transmission. The message they had prepared for years sat waiting. Simple, stripped of every word but what mattered. He glanced at his commander once more, and when she gave the smallest nod, he sent it. Across the fleet, every com channel crackled. Voices strained, static roared. Then through the chaos came a calm. Human voice, steady, deliberate, undeniable. "You have ruled with arrogance," the voice said. "You ignored the unknown. We did not. We have watched. We have prepared. You will listen, or you will vanish." The word spread like fire. On every ship, from the smallest escort to the Sovereign itself, sailors froze. Captains stared at their consoles. For a heartbeat, the unknown itself seemed to hesitate, its neatness rippling as though disturbed by the weight of a new story entering. The void dot on the Sovereign's bridge, silence fell so deep it felt as if the air had been sucked out. Varos's face went pale, then red, fury blazing in his eyes. "Who dares?" he began, but Tams was barely listening. She had leaned forward, heart pounding, as the voice continued. "We do not fight with walls. We do not fight with rhythm. We fight with noise, with mess, with survival. Break your formations, scatter your pings, cross-illuminate irregularly. Do not feed the neatness. Do not sing the song it wants to hear. If you do, you may live." The transmission cut, leaving behind silence thicker than before. For a moment, no one moved. Then murmurs broke out, whispers rising through the decks. "Someone else is out there. Someone knows. Someone is helping." Varos's hands slammed down on the console, his voice a thunderclap. "Silence that signal. Find it. Hunt it. The Empire takes no orders from shadows." But his fury could not erase what had been heard. The words had sunk too deep, seated too well. Captains who had already begun to break rhythm now did so with purpose. Sailors who had clutched their charms now twisted their combs to cough static into the void. Ships began to move with jagged independence, messy, asymmetrical. And though many still vanished, more began to linger where once they would have been erased. On Orpheus, Okoi exhaled shakily, a grim smile ghosting across his face. "They heard us." Mercer's gaze stayed fixed on the hala, where the wall flickered and bent. "No, they heard the truth. Whether they accept it, that's still to be seen." In the void between stars, the unknown recoiled slightly from the jagged noise, then pressed forward again, hungry, relentless. It did not care for pride or doctrine. It cared only for rhythm. And now, for the first time, the Empire was being taught to break its own. The Grand Wall was no longer grand. It sagged and twisted its perfect lines, unraveling under the pressure of fear and the jagged interruptions of ships that had broken discipline. From Orpheus Station, the fleet looked less like an impenetrable shield and more like a splintered mirror reflecting chaos. To Aya Mercer and her crew, it was the first sign of hope. To the Empire, it was humiliation. On the Sovereign, Grand Admiral Veros seethed as reports of disobedience came through. Frigates were breaking from their assigned vectors. Destroyers were staggering their emissions with deliberate irregularity. Even cruisers were turning their guns, not toward the unknown, but inward, cross-illuminating with jittering bursts of static. It was a violation of doctrine, a rejection of centuries of training. Yet those ships were surviving. Veros's lips curled in disgust. Cowards, he spat. Breaking rank to save their own skins. They will be punished. But even as he said it, he knew he had no power to enforce it. The cascade was accelerating. Every minute, another ship vanished, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. His wall was collapsing, and no punishment would restore it. Lieutenant Lyra Tams sat rigid at her console, her pulse hammering as she tracked the disappearances. Every time a neat line of the wall dissolved, her screen flashed red, and every time another ship broke rhythm, she saw them endure a little longer. Echoed in her head, noise is safety, rhythm is hazard. Someone had spoken the truth the Empire refused to name, and she could no longer unhear it out in the dark. The Unansi nodes screamed their ugliness, hacking chaos into the neatness that pressed against the fleet. Jagged static, staggered pulses, signals bent into shapes no algorithm could smooth. The unknown recoiled, faltered, then surged again with renewed hunger. The wisp skimmed the edge of the smooth, its hull groaning under the strain, while Solace's voice crackled into Orpheus with manic energy. It's learning, Commander. Every time we hit it, it hesitates a little less. It's adapting. If we want to keep ahead of it, we need to change the tune. Mercer ordered teams. Mercer ordered, never the same mistake twice. Humans are good at that. Okoy's fingers moved like lightning, reshaping the noise streams, bending them into uglier and uglier patterns. This thing likes its universe neat, he muttered. Let's show it the joy of mess. On the hollow ships, vanished in clusters. A wing of escorts blinked out together, erased so cleanly that the formation behind them flew on for several seconds, before realizing they were alone. Panic rippled through the Empire's comms. Some captains abandoned formation entirely, scattering. Like frightened birds, others clung desperately to doctrine, their voices shaking as they recited regulations that no longer mattered. And then, into the middle of that chaos, humanity stepped forward, revealed themselves not with banners, not with declarations, but with action. Their drives flared just enough to be seen, their signals broadcasting jagged static bursts designed to draw attention. For the first time, Imperial captains saw ships that were not their own fighting the same enemy. On the Sovereign's bridge, Tams gasped as the contacts appeared on her scope. Unknown vessels, too, maybe more. Sir, there, Veros's head snapped toward her. Enemy, her voice shook. No, sir. Shielding us. The Admiral froze. He had no words for it. The doctrine had never imagined strangers stepping out of shadows not as foes, but as guardians. And yet there they were, sliding between Imperial cruisers and the neatness pressing in, their hulls glowing faintly as they spat irregular bursts into the void. The unknown faltered, its smooth edge rippling as if confused. The Imperial ships behind them held. For the first time, ships shielded by humans did not vanish. On Orpheus, Tian whooped, unable to contain it. They're seeing us. We're standing in front of them. Mercer's eyes never left the Hala. Not too much. Not yet a shield. Not a revelation. They must believe in survival, not in us. But survival was a revelation all its own. On Imperial decks, sailors pointed at the displays, voices rising with something that sounded like hope. They didn't know who the strangers were, didn't know why they were helping, but the proof was undeniable. Ships that stood behind the newcomers lived. Ships that clung to the wall died. The truth spread faster than orders. Follow the shadows. They know how to fight it. Veros slammed a fist onto the railing, his voice cracking with rage. We do not bow to outsiders. We are the Empire. But his words sounded thin, even to him. His fleet was breaking, and no pride could stitch it back together. Lieutenant Tams looked at her console, at the strangers holding the line, and made her choice. Quietly, without asking permission, she adjusted her emissions, breaking rhythm, scattering her signals into static. Her console flared warnings of known compliance, but she ignored them. When the next wave of neatness passed, the Sovereign trembled but endured. For the first time all night, she allowed herself to breathe. The unknown struck harder now, frustrated, pressing against the mess it could not smooth. The cascade slowed, but did not stop. Imperial ships still vanished, their voices silenced mid-scream, their lights swallowed by absence, yet more lived than should have. Each second bought was another second humanity remained unbroken, another second to plan the next move. On Orpheus, Okoye leaned back, exhausted but grimly satisfied. We've turned the tide, he said. Mercer's gaze stayed locked on the hala. The Empire's wall was gone, shattered into fragments. But among those fragments were pockets of resistance, jagged little flocks of ships surviving in the shadow of human noise. No, she said softly. We've bought time. The tide hasn't turned yet, but it will. Beyond the shattered fleet, the unknown pulsed again, vast and implacable. It had been slowed, confused, irritated, but not beaten. It would come again, hungrier, stronger, and when it did, humanity would need to stand. Not only in shadows, but in the open. The fleet was dying. Even with the interference of the Anansi net, even with human cruisers breaking their cover to shield Imperial ships, the cascade did not stop. It slowed, staggered, faltered in places, but the neatness kept spreading. Every ship that clung to doctrine vanished in silence, erased as neatly as ink wiped from a page. On the Sovereign of Dawns, Grand Admiral Cale Veros stood unyielding as the walls of his empire fell around him. His knuckles were white against the railing, his eyes fixed on the collapsing formation. He barked orders with the weight of centuries behind them, but fewer and fewer captains answered. Some were gone. Some were breaking from doctrine to survive. Some were simply too afraid to speak. Lieutenant Lyra Tams no longer listened to his voice. She had made her choice. Her console was tuned to static, her signals jagged, her pings scattered like broken glass. She had disobeyed every regulation she'd ever sworn to uphold, and because of it, her ship still lived. Every time the neatness pressed in, her readings warped. Her instruments shrieked warnings, but the Sovereign endured. It was ugly, it was imperfect, and it was working. Across the void, Imperial ships began to scatter. At first, it was smaller. Frigate breaking formation, a destroyer drifting out of line. Then more followed. The wall dissolved into shards, commanders abandoning centuries of training to mimic the chaos they saw around them. Those who did lived, those who didn't vanished roared in fury. Cowards, traitors, you disgrace the Empire. But his words carried no force. The fleet was no longer his. It belonged to survival now, and survival did not care for pride. From Orpheus Station, Aya Mercer watched the collapse unfold. The hala showed the fleet unraveling into a storm of disordered signals, ships coughing static and flickering light. A chaos that looked like ruin but was, in truth, salvation. Her lips pressed into a hard line. This is the moment, she whispered. The moment they learn. Okoye leaned over the data, exhaustion etched into his face. More of them are listening, enough to matter. But the unknown is pressing. Harder, it's angry. Tian cursed under his breath, sweat shining on his brow as he juggled the Anansi nodes. We're running out of tricks. If we push the net any harder, it'll tear itself apart. Then we tear it apart, Mercer said. If it buys another hour, another minute, it's worth it. Time is survival. The wisp skimmed the edge of the neatness, her hull groaning under the strain. Rhea Solis's laughter crackled over the cum, manic and fierce. It hates us, Commander. I can feel it chewing at the hull. But it still can't swallow us. Not while we keep spitting noise. Keep spitting, Mercer replied. Spit. Until it chokes, the unknown surged. A wave of smoothness rippled across the fleet, swallowing a dozen ships in an instant. Whole clusters vanished, gone before their captains could scream. The Hala flared red with loss. Panic shuddered through what remained of the Empire's armada. On the Sovereign, sailors clutched their charms, their prayers spilling from trembling lips. Some cried openly, some stared blankly at the void, waiting for erasure. Tams's hands shook on her console, but she held her course, scattering her signals, breaking rhythm. Her heart hammered as another wave passed over them and left them alive. She looked up, and for the first time, she saw fear in her admiral's eyes. "Sir," she whispered, though she knew he would not listen. "We're not the center anymore. We never were." Veros did not answer. His gaze was fixed on the dying wall, on the fragments of his fleet, dissolving into silence. For a man who had built his life on control, the collapse was worse than death. On Orpheus, Mercer exhaled through her nose, steadying herself. "The mighty are falling," she said. "Softly, the Empire will not survive this." Okoye glanced at her, his voice low. "And us?" Her scar gleamed pale in the light. "We survive. That's what we do. That's what we've always done." The Hala flickered again. The unknown pressed in, relentless, vast, unstoppable. But among the ruin of the Empire's fleet, pockets of survival remained dougly messy, human pockets of ships that had learned too late the lesson Orpheus had carried for years. Noise was safety. Rhythm was hazard. The collapse of the mighty was almost complete. What remained was no longer an empire. It was a scattering of survivors, shielded by shadows they had once ignored, saved by a humanity they had never thought worthy of notice. And, as the silence deepened, Aya Mercer whispered the truth that the galaxy would soon learn. The age of empires is over. The age of survival has begun. The remains of the Empire's grand fleet fled like embers scattered by a wind. Where once 1,000 ships had gleamed in flawless symmetry, only fragments remained, their lights ragged, their signals broken, their commanders clinging to survival with the desperation of drowning men. They had abandoned the wall, abandoned the illusion of order, and drifted now in uneven clusters, hiding behind the jagged static that had kept some of them alive. But the unknown pursued. It did not roar, it did not strike, it simply smoothed. Whole pockets of ships were tidied away, erased as though they had never existed, their absence marked only by the sudden silence on the comms. The survivors pressed inward, clinging to one another, until finally they reached the place chosen for their last stand, a dying star. The star was swollen and red. Its light stretched thin, its surface bubbling with storms that flared and faded like the breath of a sick giant. Around it the fleet gathered, battered and trembling, a broken crown circling a corpse of fire. Their weapons primed, their hulls scarred, their spirits frayed to the edge of madness. And yet still they clung to the hope that here, at this graveyard of light, they might make a final stand. On the Sovereign Yuvdon's Grand Admiral Veros stood at the command dais, his uniform torn, his face haggard, but his spine unbroken. Around him his officers worked in grim silence, their fear written in every motion. He had lost his wall, lost his fleet, lost the truth he had built his life upon. But he had not lost his pride. "This is where we hold," he said, his voice cracked but steady. "This is where we prove the Empire endures." Lieutenant Lyra Tams stared at him with hollow eyes. She no longer believed. She had seen the truth. Noise was safety, rhythm was hazard. She had broken doctrine. She had scattered her signals, and it had saved them again and again. But her admiral would not bend, not even now. He would throw what remained of the fleet into the fire for the sake of honor. And perhaps, she thought, there was nothing left for him but that dot around the star. The ships aligned. Guns turned outward, drives shifted to anchor them in orbit, shields flared to full. It was a spectacle, a display of defiance meant to impress the eyes of the galaxy, but the galaxy was not watching. Only the unknown watched, and it did not care for spectacle. From Orpheus Station, Aya Mercer watched the Halley with a face carved from stone. The Anansi net flickered and sputtered, its nodes burning themselves out one by one. They had bought time, slowed the tide, but the unknown pressed harder with every second. Humanity had revealed itself, had stepped out of the shadows to shield Imperial ships, and now their cover was gone. The Empire knew they existed, The unknown knew they existed. There was no going back. "They won't survive this," Okoye whispered, his voice hoarse. "They're feeding it again, standing in lines, radiating symmetry. It will erase them. Faster than ever." "Then we give them cover," Mercer replied. Her scar stood out pale as ice. "If they die with the truth in their ears. That's worth something." Rhea Solis's voice crackled from the wisp, fierce and eager. "Say the word, Commander. We'll light the sky." "Light it," Mercer said. The NNZ nodes screamed their final noise into the void. The stealth cruisers flared their drives, spitting static across every band, scattering chaos into the neatness that pressed closer and closer. For a moment, the unknown faltered, its smooth surface rippling as if confused. For a moment, the fleet lived. On the Sovereign, Tams's console lit with interference, jagged and ugly, the mark of humanity's hand. She whispered, under her breath, a prayer she hadn't meant to speak aloud. "Thank you." The Admiral heard her. His eyes narrowed. "You believe in them," he said, his voice sharp with fury. "I believe in survival," she answered, surprising herself with the strength in her tone, "and they're the only reason we're still here." Varos's face twisted with rage, but before he could reply, the unknown struck. The neatness surged like a tide, sweeping across the fleet. Ships vanished in clusters, their lights extinguished. Mid-fight cruisers, destroyers, escorts, whole formations erased in silence. The red star flared as though in sympathy, its surface boiling with storms that lit the void in bloody light. Still, the survivors fought. They fired their guns into the dark volleys of plasma and torpedoes that struck nothing and burned away. They screamed into their coms, their voices raw, their signals jagged, their fear a weapon as much as their guns. And for every ship that vanished, another spat defiance, another refused to go quietly. Humanity moved among them. Shadow ships darting through the chaos, shielding the survivors with noise, coughing static into the neatness, dragging captains through narrow corridors. Of survival, they did not save everyone. They could not. But they saved some. On the Sovereign, Varro stood tall as the walls closed in. His fleet was gone. His wall was gone. His empire was gone. All that remained was a dying star and the knowledge that he had been wrong. He looked at Tams, at the young lieutenant who had defied him, and for the first time his eyes softened. "Survive," he said quietly, not to her, not to anyone in particular, but to whoever might still be listening. Then he turned back to the void and raised his hand. In a final salute, the Sovereign shuddered as the neatness closed around her. Tams felt the deck tremble, the lights flicker, the silence reach for them. She clenched her fists and whispered the words again. "Noise is safety." Her console screamed as she forced it into chaos, scattering the ship's signals into jagged static. The Sovereign trembled, but she did not vanish. Not yet. From Orpheus, Mercer watched the flagship endure a heartbeat longer, 2 heartbeats, 3. She allowed herself a thin smile. Humanity had given them that. Humanity had changed the story. The last stand of the Empire was not glorious. It was not neat. It was not remembered in the way they had hoped, but it was loud, ragged, desperate. It was human, and when the silence finally fell, when the red star dimmed and the fleet was nothing but echoes, humanity remained. The void after battle was worse than the battle itself. Silence stretched across the dying star, a silence too clean, too absolute, as if the universe itself had pressed a hand over its mouth. Where once the Empire's fleet had blazed like a crown of fire, only fragments remained, tattered wreckage glowing faintly as it tumbled through orbit. The twisted bones of ships that had once been cities. The Sovereign Novdons was gone, erased along with her admiral, her decks, swallowed in the neatness that left no grave to mourn. In Orpheus Station, the crew stood in silence before the hala. The map of the fleet had been a lattice of light only. Hours ago, now it was a sparse scattering of flickers, each representing a survivor, each one clinging to life in the shadow of absence. Aya Mercer closed her eyes for a moment, not in prayer, but in respect. The Empire had been arrogant, blind, and cruel, but men and women had died here, and death deserved witness. "They're gone," Jules Okoye said softly. His voice was hoarse, hollow. "All the wall, all the crown, all the pride. They're just gone." "Not all," Mercer answered. She opened her eyes, her scar pale against her skin. Look, the hollow pulsed with faint signals, irregular, jagged, ugly survivors, a handful of Imperial ships scattered across the void, each one coughing static, their emissions broken and messy. They had listened, they had learned, they had survived. On one of those ships, a battered cruiser called the Herald of Dawn, sailors sat in stunned silence at their stations. Their captain was gone, erased along with the command deck, but the crew had followed the message they'd heard. Break rhythm, scatter signals, make noise. Now, against all odds, they still lived. A junior officer clutched his console, eyes wide as he whispered, "We lived because of them." The shadows. They were. No one argued. None dared. On Orpheus, Tian sagged in his chair, braids slipping loose from his wrist. "We did it," he murmured. "We made it choke. We saved them." Okoye shook his head, rubbing his eyes. "We didn't win. We didn't even fight. We just survived, and that's enough." Mercer let out a long breath. "That's everything." From the Wisp, Rhea Solis's laughter rang through the coms, ragged but fierce. "We pulled it off, Commander. The unknown took its feast, but we snatched scraps from its jaws. The Empire's fleet is gone, but we're still here. Humanity's still here." Mercer nodded slowly. "And now the galaxy will know it, because the truth was inescapable now. The Empire had declared itself the unchallenged master of the stars, but it had fallen in silence before an enemy it had refused to acknowledge. And when its fleet had faced annihilation, it had been humanity's. The survivors would carry that story home. They would whisper of the shadows who had shielded them, of the ragged noise that had saved their lives. They would remember. On the remains of the Herald of Dawn, a young ensign stood before a cracked viewport, staring out at the wreckage drifting against the swollen red star. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered words she had never spoken before. "Thank you." She didn't know who she was thanking. She didn't need to. In Orpheus, the crew turned away from the hollow one by one, heavier than gravity. Some cried quietly, some laughed, brittle and sharp, some simply sat, staring into the dark. Mercer remained standing, her eyes still on the flickering survivor signals. She spoke softly, as if to herself. "We've revealed ourselves now. There's no hiding anymore. The unknown knows us. The Empire will know us. The galaxy will know us." She paused, her voice steady despite the weight in it. "Let them know. Let them remember. We are not the biggest. We are not the brightest, but we endure. We are the noise that will not be smoothed away." The silence outside deepened, endless and uncaring. But within that silence, something new had begun. Humanity had stepped from the shadows, not with banners, not with parades, but with survival. Against the unknown they had stood firm where empires had crumbled. Against arrogance they had chosen humility. Against neatness they had chosen noise. And in that choice they had written the first line of a new story. The Empire's fleet lay in ruins. The unknown remained vast and unbroken. But humanity, small and stubborn, had endured. And from the ashes of empires, a new dawn rose ragged, imperfect, defiant. The galaxy would never be the same again.